This is the Lew Rockwell Show.
Well, today it's great to have as our guest on the show the other Dr. Paul. This is Dr. Rand Paul. Rand is Ron's son. He's an ophthalmologist practicing in Kentucky. He's worked on tax issues both in North Carolina and Kentucky for a long time. And now with the questions about Senator Bunning in Kentucky, will he run, will he not run, Rand has formed an exploratory committee himself to think about running. And Rand, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about what it was like to grow up as the son of Ron Paul?
Well, I tell people when they ask me if I know Lew Rockwell that I used to ride to work with Lew Rockwell and Ron Paul back in the late 1970s, maybe early 1980s when I was in high school. Mm-hmm. I was always very interested in politics, and I would go and spend a month or so in the summer in Washington, D.C. and work as an intern in the office. And I got to hear all kinds of great conversations on the way to work about philosophy, politics, religion, you name it. And I guess I was always very, very interested in that and read a lot of the different free market economists, political philosophers, novelists, you name it, as a kid getting interested in this.
You know, the other day you made a very interesting YouTube explaining where your name came from. Do you want to reprise that for us for a second?
Yeah, we've had great fun with that. There have been a lot of stories, and some both good and bad. Some people love Ayn Rand, and they think it's really neat. Oh, he was named after Ayn Rand. And then other people hate Ayn Rand and think, what a crazy Ron Paul that he named his kid after Ayn Rand. And actually, none of it's really true. I was named by my parents Randall, and was Randy as a kid. And then when I got married, my wife said that I needed a more adult name, and she took the Y from my name and never gave it back. So now I've been going by Rand mostly as an adult, and but it never really had much to do with Ayn Rand. But when I formed my first taxpayer group in North Carolina, the very first reporter that asked me about my name, he said, well, were you named after Ayn Rand? And it was funny, we shortened the name but really hadn't thought that we'd get so many questions. But I have told people it was one of the first books that my dad gave me. I remember when I was 17, my dad gave me a collection of Ayn Rand novels and sort of the 3 or 4 main novels, and I read those and was really excited by the individualism that she talked about, and from her went on to, I guess, become interested in a lot of other authors of the same genre.
Bring us up to date now on what's happening with Senator Bunning. What's the political landscape?
Well, a week ago we formed an exploratory committee, which is a formal way to be able to raise money and participate in the process. We formed an exploratory committee instead of an outright committee because it's still uncertain what he'll do. In American politics, as you know, it's almost impossible to beat an incumbent. I always joke with people that the incumbency rate is higher in the U.S. Congress than it was in the Soviet Politburo. So it's very hard to dislodge an incumbent. He's now 77. There have been some questions of whether or not he's losing some of his interest in the, keeping up with politics. In the last election, he refused to debate his opponent face-to-face and did it from a studio in Washington. At one point was asked if he read the newspaper and said it had been 6 weeks since he had read a newspaper. So things like that show him a little bit disengaged. He said he's running, but he's also said if he doesn't raise enough money, he won't run. He also then encouraged a candidate about a week ago, and he says, oh, yeah, my good friend Trey Grayson, why don't you form a committee, and then you can run if I decide not to run. So people are uncertain, really, of his motives. So we've formed this committee. We're raising money. We have a website, randpaul2010.com, and we've got some good interest so far on it, and we're in the process of setting up fundraisers in Texas, California, Florida, and New York City.
Well, that's great. So you feel you're able to do national fundraising. Of course, that's very unusual for even a Senate candidate.
Yeah, and I think it's the way you have to win this race is you have to nationalize it. Most of the national pundits are looking at 2 races. If Bunning drops out, Kentucky will be one, and Pennsylvania is the other. And so I think there is a possibility that we get conservative and libertarian and free market groups interested in this nationally, and that we could have a real chance. The other interesting thing is our primary will only have about 100,000 voters. So if it's a 3 or 4 way race, you could possibly win with 30 or 40,000 votes.
Rand, what are the issues? Is it the economy? Is it the recession?
I think so. A year ago when my father ran for president, the Iraq war was still a big issue. I think it's less so of an issue now, and it's really, I talk mostly about the bank bailout and the deficit. I talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve, maybe not as much as my father, but in the sense that I like to use the old Andy Jackson quote where he said, I'm one of those who doesn't believe that the national debt is a national blessing, but rather a curse upon the people, inasmuch as it is calculated to bring about the administration of moneyed aristocracy dangerous to our liberty. So I think there's a connection between the deficit and having a Federal Reserve. You have a Federal Reserve because that's how you finance a deficit. If you didn't have a deficit, you wouldn't need a central bank, but they really go hand in hand, and that's why those who like the Federal Reserve see its necessity, because that's how they monetize a large national debt.
But, even though the Iraq War is not, I'll agree, as much of an issue in people's minds as it was during your dad's campaign, the price of the thing goes on. I mean, the price of these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and as your dad always points out, the whole empire is like $1 trillion a year, probably significantly more than $1 trillion a year. If one is worried about the deficit, don't you have to talk about foreign policy?
Exactly, and that's what one of the lines that I'll use is that Republicans for years have said, well, we can't balance the budget, or we could if we just cut off that welfare queen. And the Democrats will sometimes, some of the better Democrats will say, well, there's a lot of waste in the military budget. If we cut there, we could balance the budget. And I tell people the truth of the matter is you could only ever approach balancing the budget is if you looked across the board at every program. You're going to have to cut everywhere. And my father likes to say that it might be a little easier in the military budget because you wouldn't have to be cutting people off their Social Security benefits and things. But realistically, I think you have to look across the board at everything, Medicare, Social Security, the military budget. And I think the best way to actually do it would be to simplify the debate down to the point of what would it take to balance the budget next year. And I looked at the statistics recently, and it would be introducing the budget from 2002 would balance the budget next year with no changes. And I think if you could make a big nationwide debate, if you were actually running for president and could make that a big debate, I think you'd find that the American people would actually go for that. I find people every day in my office, they complain, Republicans and Democrats, they're upset that neither one of them are addressing the deficit.
Rand, everybody's so worried about unemployment. I mean, we see the unemployment rate continues to go up. The dollar is plummeting, as your dad has long said would happen. People are, just terrified about the economic future. Sometimes they expect politicians to fix that. And, of course, in a sense, they can fix it. But, what do you say to people who want you to go to Washington and fix things for them?
Well, I think that's very hard publicly because, you realize this. You have to liquidate the debt in order to get new jobs, and the quicker you liquidate it, the faster you get jobs. But that doesn't help you when you're trying to explain to the guy that's going to lose his job. I think you have to have someone who can present the message of capitalism in the sense that it is the greatest economic system ever known to man, that capitalism provides the greatest amount of wealth to the most people, and we have to be able to present that in a way that shows that it does create the jobs. I always like to point towards, there was a Soviet propaganda film where they came and showed a video of some tenement building in New York City, and they wanted to prove how terrible the poor lived in our country. But it backfired on the Soviets because the Soviet people looked in the window of the tenements and they saw everybody had a color television set. So we have to prove to people that while we have poverty in our country, the poorest people in our country live so much better than the vast majority of the world, and it's because of our economic system. We need to not apologize and say, oh, we need more regulations. We need to realize that the problems we've had in our economy recently, and I think it's the biggest debate of the last 30 years, is what caused the panic of 2008, and we need to lay the blame squarely where it's deserved, not on capitalism, but on the Federal Reserve for manipulating the interest rates.
What do you see as the role of the central government? Simply returning things to the state by repealing Roe v. Wade? I believe that's your dad's position.
I think that's the better way, and I think one of the things that under the original Constitution was that almost all crimes were state crimes. There were almost no crimes for murder. I think treason was about it. And other than that, most of these crimes should be done at a local level. And I think you're finding more and more of that. Even the drug issue, I think, doesn't scare people as much as it once did. I tell people one of my favorite interviews I've ever seen was when George Bush was being accused of using cocaine in his youth. They interviewed Cal Thomas and 2 or 3 other people from the Christian right. It might have even been Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell. And they said, with a 15-year-old kid in your parish was caught using drugs, what would you want to do? Would you want to put him in prison or have him have some counseling? and every one of these ministers and Christian writers all said they'd prefer counseling. So I think if you can have a reasoned discussion without people being so afraid of the issue, I think most people are of the opinion, I've got teenage sons. If one of them made a mistake, for goodness sake, I wouldn't want them in jail for 10 years.
No, and of course also there's the price of the jails. So many of the people in jail, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's a very significant percentage are in there for victimless drug crimes, and at a huge cost, whether it's to the people of Kentucky or nationally in the federal prison system.
Yeah, and it also makes it we don't have room for the violent criminals. And so you have, for example, in Kentucky, you can commit murder and you can be eligible for parole in 12 years, and some of the eligibility for parole comes from not having enough room to keep them.